First of all, I would like to thank Dean Jaworski and Professor Sate and the rest of the management school here for inviting me today, and of course to Jeremy Hunter for our collaboration. Now, many of you, well, all of you have heard from our Costa Rica guests this morning. And you heard the extent to which a number of Costa Rican companies are integrating sustainability into what they do to a greater or lesser extent. But many of you may still be wondering, what exactly does that have to do with good management, which is really the theme that Peter Drucker devoted his life to. And some of you may have a background question. What's that? What? And some of you may have a background question as to whether sustainability is really just a green or an environmentalist agenda. So what Jeremy and I are proposing to do this morning, as Dean Jaworski suggested, is we want to step back a little bit and show you how this has become a mainline business conversation and how it has evolved, how the theme of sustainability has gone from being seen as a cost to a driver of competitive advantage, and now to embrace a vision of human flourishing and of all life on Earth flourishing, and what exactly that means for you. So really what I want to do is start in homage to Peter Drucker and to recall his work, both big ideas on the topic of managing in turbulent times in the 21st century, managing during an age of discontinuity, but also his focus on very specific practices of the effective executive or people in performance and entrepreneurship and so on. Now, like in many things, Peter was ahead of his time in thinking about the issues that fall under the umbrella of sustainability. In particular, he said that every single social and global issue of our day is a business opportunity in disguise. And I think that that is a perfect framing for how we can start to think about what sustainability means for business today. In other words, where other people saw cost, Peter Drucker saw opportunity. And that's saying quite something, given that if you consider historically in the last 30 years, sustainability was really categorized under environmental health and safety, corporate social responsibility, even the triple bottom line. These were seen essentially as necessary costs. And I ask you to think, if you were the CEO of a publicly traded company, what would your relationship with that topic be? How would you see those topics of environmental health and safety, corporate social responsibility? You'd probably feel these are necessary things that, business has to take on a degree of ethical responsibility for the world around that, and it has to put into place these safeguards. But these are not things that a CEO would be tremendously excited about in terms of the success of the organization going forward. Now, what's interesting is that in the last 7 or 8 years, and I think Professor Sate mentioned it, that there has been the significant change. If you look at the last 7 to 8 years, there has been a significant change in the mindset of business. And what that change is to really seeing that sustainability is strategy. And I want to explain a little bit what I mean by that. So, for a while there, we saw companies taking sustainability attributes or, little elements of environmental health and social and making commitments to it that were really on the fringe of the core business. But a growing number of companies are embedding sustainability into their core business strategy and operations. It's actually how they succeed. And I'll give you an example. DuPont, the big chemical company, founded in 1802, has gone through many different lives, as it were, over this 210-year history. A recent CEO of DuPont said, sustainability commitments are not just good for our business, they are our business. And if you look at what DuPont is doing in terms of sustainable agriculture, in terms of their acquisitions of Pioneer and Pioneer seeds and Soleil nutritional products in emerging markets, and their leadership to try to raise carbon trading in and lobbying the US government to put into place carbon trading, you see that this company is making, as a life sciences company, they are making sustainability really at the center of everything they do. But okay, that's just one company, you might ask. Well, what about the larger population of companies? Well, here I think we've got two interesting surveys we can point to. The first is by the MIT Sloan Management Review together with the Boston Consulting Group. They've been doing every year for the last 3 years surveys of about 3,000 executives to ask them their views of how sustainability is relevant to their business goals. And there's an astonishing change. 4 or 5 years ago, it would have been a third of all the executives saying that sustainability really should be on the CEO agenda, or that it really does drive competitive strategy. Well, last year, in a survey of 2,800 executives in 40 different countries, the result was 67% of those executives said that sustainability is critical to competitive advantage. And a McKinsey study last year really came to similar conclusions. So I think we've come a long way in terms of how companies talk about sustainability. But if many of you in the audience are saying, well, that's all fine and good to say those things, but is that actually translating into results? Is that translating into value? You would be asking the right question. And in fact, there is a big gap between companies that say sustainability is important and those that reap financial rewards. And by the way, those surveys show you exactly the same thing. But what we can say is that something is changing in the external market environment that requires a different way to think about what it takes to compete. And so what I want to propose to you this morning, this is part of what Dean Jaworski was saying about stepping back a little bit. If we step back a little bit from what do we mean by sustainability in the business world, I want you to think about sustainability in terms of value creation terms, not an environmental or social agenda that's separate from business, but about the goal of creating value. But that business today is, in fact, required by the marketplace to create value in 2 dimensions and not in 1. So we're simply not in that Milton Friedman world of 1970 in which shareholder value was the only way to think about the role of business. We live in a world where companies have to create value for stakeholders and shareholders together. And I'm going to tell you why in a second, what exactly has changed in the market environment to make that so. But what we can say is that in today's market environment, where you, as a business manager, are going to have to take into account the value you're creating or destroying for your stakeholders, when you think about how to succeed in creating value for your customers and shareholders, you really have 4 alternatives. So this quadrant, unfortunately, is where many companies are. And maybe many American companies in particular. They are creating shareholder value, right? Would you agree? That upper left, they're creating shareholder value, but they're destroying stakeholder value. So in a way, you could say that they're creating shareholder value on the backs of key stakeholders. And that incurs business risks. Customer deselection. If you're a supplier to Walmart and you're in that quadrant, you will be deselected. It's not just lowest price anymore when you're supplying to Walmart. You lose market share. It hurts your reputation. It can incur fines and penalties. Now, another case of value transfer is the bottom right. And bottom right, just think for a minute, what's happening here? You're creating value for your stakeholders, right, for society and environment, but you're losing money for your shareholders and investors. So that's essentially a case of charity or philanthropy. It's also a case of a company that's not going to be around very long. So really what we're talking about, we're not talking about value destruction. That's really not an interesting case. But sustainable value is where you create value for your stakeholders in a way that allows you to create even more value for your customers and shareholders. And I think that's really the definition that that Jeremy and I would like to leave you with as you think about sustainability, that it's about doing good for society and the environment in a way that allows you to do even better for your customers and shareholders than you otherwise would. Now, companies that are able to do this are finding a whole new way to compete. And I just want to give you one example. A $750 million annual sales company in Minneapolis that produces what you see up here, floor cleaning equipment. Now, this is a 150-year-old company. And when the CEO went to a trade show in 2002, so 10 years ago, what he saw was that there were dozens of different companies making this kind of equipment. There were hundreds of models, and they all did the same thing. The colors were different of the models. Basically, all the companies were working on reducing chemical toxicity or making or using less chemicals. So less chemicals and or making the chemicals that were being used less toxic. Now, the CEO of this company figured out an entirely new model. He found a way to remove chemicals altogether. So cleaning equipment, zero chemicals. But what he did was he found a way to take tap water and electrolyze it. So there's a whole process you can see under blended stream. Basically, you take tap water, you oxygenate it, so you put little bubbles into the water, and then you run an electric current through it, and that puts the water is ionized into an acidic state, which is good at sanitizing, and an alkaline state, which is what it sounds like, it's good at cleaning. And then they developed these other technologies, split stream technology, which is where there's a membrane in the machine that keeps the acidic state and the alkaline state separate for periods of time. And then electroporation was known in research labs for a very long time. This is where you take a water molecule and you put an electric charge on it that's sufficient so that when it is sprayed on virus or bacteria, it destroys the cell. And in fact, that's an example. You see E. coli, no spray, and it's after a 2-second spray, that's what it looks like. Electroporation is a process of changing the cell wall. The reason it's called irreversible, you can look at the picture of the second bacteria there, and you can get a clue why it's irreversible. So they have developed this also into a hand device, which they have not succeeded so far. So, there are interesting challenges. And as Vijay, Professor Satya, and I have discussed at length, it's a very fascinating case of a company that meets disbelief, particularly among competitors, because hey, they can't do that. Can you do floor cleaning equipment without chemicals? No, that's not the way we do things around here. But this wouldn't be an interesting story if I couldn't show you this, which is they started the chemical-free cleaning in 2006. And you can see that until 2006, they were basically tracking the Dow Jones Industrial Index. And after 2006, you can see that they exceeded it. And during the recession, because of the sensitivity in building sector, they took a bigger hit than the average. But by today, even if you look at today's stock price, you'll see this is a story of a company that is doing better than the market average. And they're growing faster than their competitors. And it's all because their differentiation is chemical-free cleaning. Now, there are many companies that are doing that. We don't have time here. That's not the objective. But there are interesting cases. This Ecovative is a recent company that is developing packaging products from seed husks and mushroom fiber. You've got salt, this company that is making jewelry from landmines and unexploded ordnance. I kid you not. You've got Icebreaker in New Zealand that has been written up in 2 Harvard Business Review cases. It's all about sustainability through and through using merino wool. The Triodos Bank, which is an 8 trillion asset bank in the UK and in England, UK and the Netherlands. And by the way, this bank, it's really worth looking into if you're interested. This is a good example of financial services that embeds sustainability as its way to be more successful than other banks. So these are sort of all specialty things. But you know what? What's amazing, and the world isn't really telling the story yet, you've got all these big competitors that are seeing the light. Waste Management, the CEO of Waste Management, Daniel Steiner, is now saying, we're not going to get paid based on tipping fees in our business for going forward. We need to be getting paid by helping our customers reduce waste. How's that for a business model? And extracting resources from garbage. Then you've got DuPont, I cited already, that has moved into a life sciences company whose mission is to solve many of the global challenges that we face. You've got IBM, that's often ranked now as one of the most sustainable companies because their Smarter City and Smarter Planet initiatives are designed at connecting a world that is a more livable world with less environmental damage. And of course, Walmart has been written about. Some of you may hate Walmart here. Others, get red dots when you hear that. But they've done a lot in terms of what they pushed into their supply chains. Now, you may ask, why is this going on? So here's the claim I would like you to consider. This is not a moral awakening of a select group of CEOs. This is not a group of individuals who woke up one day and said, oh, I've got an epiphany, I better behave a little better, take care of the world for my granddaughter. This is a change in the marketplace where you have to look at how value is created. Now, in some sense, value has always been a function determined by customers, investors, and regulators on the demand side, and products, facilities, and supply chains on the supply side, with employees covering both. But we have now new constraints on our small, crowded planet that have to be taken into account. So you've got declining resources. Declining resources in terms of topsoil, in terms of fossil fuels, in terms of clean air, in terms of many of the ingredients that go into the things we buy. And then on the demand side, we have rising expectations, where all these groups you see on the demand side expect business to provide their products and services in a way where it's being procured responsibly, produced responsibly, can be used responsibly, and disposed responsibly. And if we had time, I could give you a lot of historic analysis of how that has changed. But if you look back 50 years, we would never accept the kind of products and services that were produced 50 years ago in terms of the level of externalities back then, right? So we keep raising the bar. And then finally, we have this phenomenon of radical transparency, where it's possible for any individual or group to sort of look into the life cycle value chain of a business. And if that company is seen as doing something that is highly undesirable, well, it can be shared globally and put up on YouTube the next day and so on. So if you look at these briefly, because of limited time, I'm also going to try to push fast ahead here. Declining resources. I mean, sort of a great symbol of this, which is particularly visible in Japan, is bluefin tuna, which was thriving in all the oceans in all our oceans, and now has been fished to the point where it has been overfished everywhere except in the Antarctic waters. And you see this adult specimen having sold for $396,000. I was delighted that the news item for this came out a week before I had to submit my final manuscript to the publisher for my last book. And then, yes, it got in. And then a year later, the news was that the new record was exactly twice this. So the piece in my book is obviously quite outdated now. But if you look at the commodity price index, over a 20-year period. You can see for yourself, there's a relative stability all the way until 2002, and then two things happen. You start seeing the commodity price index driven to a large extent by fossil fuels and food and beverage being driven up and becoming more volatile. And it takes a dip when we have a world recession. But when that world recession goes over, well, guess what? India and China and Brazil are going to continue growing, and the middle classes in those countries are going to continue wanting to raise up their standards. So, you know, we have one fixed Earth, right? This was the number of Earths discussion we had, but we have growing demand, which is defined by both the population and the affluence of the population and the technology they have at their disposal. So all of this is becoming a threat to supply chains. I can't tell you in my consulting practice how many business people come to me and say, you know, I hate this word sustainability. I don't understand it, but I'm getting a lot of pressure from customers, and in my supply chains, my costs are going up. My customers are asking for different kinds of products now. Help me. Radical transparency. I don't know if you can see it on this image very well, but this is a Google Earth shot of a textile plant in China that produces blue jeans. And until recently, you had to be motivated to use Google Earth to do this kind of search to see it, right? Well, guess what? Pretty soon, you'll be able to know this on the consumer tag in the store. When you buy a blue jean, there's going to be a tag that will tell you, it'll have a single score that will have not only the chemical dye usage, but the water usage and the impact, the cotton sourcing for the blue jean. And they just developed now, there's a sustainable apparel coalition that includes Nike, Gap, Levi's, and many of the others. You may have heard of this. They're really looking to develop this product label sustainability score. Of course, you know, Walmart is doing this too with their sustainability index. And they just developed, if you can see bottom right there, the Higg Index, released in July 2002, that will give consumers in a couple of years an easy way to see whether blue jean A or blue jean B, what their economic price will be one thing, but their cost to the earth will also be reflected in that one index. And already we have sites like Good Guide here, which covers 100,000 products. You can go to this and you can see for blue jeans, Polo, out of 10, 10 is good, 1 is bad. They get a 4, but you can also see competitors. And if you care about these things, you can see, well, you know, Levi's and Prana have a much higher rating. And by the way, there's an app for this on your iPhone. So the good news is that you can create a lot of business value if you know how. You know, if you can embed sustainability rather than bolt it on. But most companies are still stuck at these bottom two levels. What are they doing? They're mitigating risk, or they're reducing their energy costs, they're cutting waste, they're reducing materials intensity. You know, that's good, but that's not where the exciting stuff is for the CEO. These next 4 levels, how can you differentiate your products with sustainability attributes? How can you go into entirely new markets to solve some of these global problems, or to reach customers you wouldn't otherwise have reached because you have these sustainability attributes? How can you enhance your reputation and influence industry standards, all with innovation? Now, 7, 8 months ago, I would have stopped here. This is what I've been doing for the last 10 years, and I've been trying to make the business case, and, you know, this is where we should be, right? We're a school of management. We got to teach students how to create value, how to succeed in business. Look at the business case for sustainability. It's great. I'm not so convinced anymore. And I think on the back of this little handout we have there's a Peter Drucker quote on the back that says, today's certainties become tomorrow's absurdities. Right. So I'm at least questioning what I have felt to be the truth for the last 10 years. So really, the question that Jeremy and I have, in preparing this, we've talked about is the business case for sustainability enough? And I want to suggest to you perhaps not. And really, it comes from 2 relatively easy observations for you to make yourself. We need to ask, is the business case enough for shareholders, and is it enough for stakeholders, right? That matrix, those are the 2 dimensions of the matrix. Now, For shareholders, I would say the answer is no. Even though you have a lot of execs saying, yes, it's a huge source of competitive advantage, their results show that they're not actually reaping financial rewards the way they wish that they were. So there's something going on there where current approaches to embedding sustainability aren't working for investors, managers. Now, for stakeholders, I think the answer has to be no also. Because all the efforts that business is undertaking to try to make the world more sustainable, it's only slowing down the damage we're doing, right? So it's about reducing negative footprint. When you read what companies are saying in their sustainability reports, they're saying they're cutting CO2 emissions, they're reducing energy use, they're reducing water usage. Take Florida Ice and Farm, for example. They're cutting water usage down to 3.5 liters for a liter of beer. That's fantastic. They're cutting carbon to 0, like many others. But they're cutting waste. But that's only getting you to do less harm. That's not the same thing as creating a positive handprint. There's a woman in Australia who has come up with this idea. We have to reduce our negative footprint, but we also need business to make a positive handprint. And it's not just that this is a moral argument. This is where the biggest business opportunities are going to lie in the years ahead. So I'm just about finished here. I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy. But I want to leave you with the idea that we do need to go beyond competitive advantage. We need to reframe the goal for business to be in support of flourishing, which has this idea of healthy whole systems at the level of the world. I think we're all tired of the word sustainability. We don't necessarily need continuity. You can have a very bleak world where we continue to hand our future generations the same thing that we have in a bleak world. Is that what we want? No. We need something more inspiring. And so healthy whole systems, that implies flourishing business that's creating sustainable value, but it also implies something else that very few people, although I think Peter Drucker did have very clear focus on this, but today very few people have attention on, and that is flourishing individuals. When he talked about wisdom workers, when he moved from industrial workers to wisdom workers, he was already thinking about this sort of thing, taking care of how the role individuals played. So there are some companies, and I've chosen one from Latin America. This is my last example, and I hope I'm somewhat on time. This is a company, Natura, I'm sure many of you know it, that is a cosmetic and personal care product. Their sales are $3 billion, and they also have very healthy profits on those sales, something like $450 million on $3 billion. And it's incredible when you look at their mission statement. It's all about creating well-being and being well, where they define well-being as the harmonious, pleasant relationship of a person with oneself and with one's body. And being well is the empathetic, successful, and gratifying relationship of a person with others and with nature and with the whole. Imagine for a moment if this is the way business thought about conducting themselves in the world. And it's through and through their supply chains. It's how they deal with their employees, their salespeople, their suppliers, and so on. An inspiring company, and perhaps, not surprisingly, coming from Latin America. Thank you.
So good morning. I have to share with you a couple of things. First, thank you very much to Vijay for introducing me to Chris, because it has been a conversation I've been wanting to have for over a decade about what's the relationship between cultivating oneself and sustainability. When we first came to the Drucker School, our first project at the Quality of Life Research Center was something called Alternatives to Materialism, because we knew that Western civilization had basically answered the question of how do you answer the challenge of improving well-being through materialism. And we knew that that was not a sustainable solution. And so one of the reasons why I developed the courses I did was to be able to give people in this context the ability to cultivate their own well-being by themselves. And so the conversation has kind of, for me personally, come around full circle. and I'm very excited and happy to be here. Despite my excitement and happiness to be here, I have to also tell you that I'm a bit under the weather. So I am, as it were, PUI, or presenting under the influence. So if my speech slurs or something doesn't make sense, please, I ask for your forgiveness. So, on with the show. When Chris and I started talking about the idea of flourishing, I started to think about, okay, what do we actually mean by this? And I think there's a great Drucker theme here. When we ask, in order for flourishing to happen, we have to move from an old world to a new one, from a world that doesn't work to one that works a little bit better than that. And if we think about the world as it is right now and what I've just kind of prefaced, how the notion of development has been approached in our modern society has largely been about focusing on transforming matter. So, and we've gotten really good at it, right? So this is if you can see that in the upper left-hand corner, that's the Newcomen engine, which was one of the first great steam-powered devices that was widely used in Europe starting in around 1712. And it was one of the first tools of the Industrial Revolution. So as we move on, right, we have the mass production of steel to now, 300 years later, nanoscale micro devices and atom smashers, right? So we have this tremendous capacity to transform matter. And as we all know, it's upgraded, at least in the so-called developed nations, right, which we mean really the nations with the best stuff. We've upgraded our material quality of life in ways that 100 years ago to aristocracy would be unimaginable, right? I mean, you have, even just thinking about the smartphone, right? Mr. Spock had nothing on an iPhone, right? And so we've got great goodies. And I want to say also that I'm not anti-materialistic. Come over to my house and you'll see that I'm not. But there's some problems, right? So the question, does enhancing material wealth also enhance well-being? The question is undoubtedly yes, if you're poor. This is a very well-established finding. I don't know if you can see the little red dot, but the question of do economic gains enhance well-being? The answer is yes. And this has been referenced by the speakers earlier this morning, right? If you help people out of poverty and solve their basic survival needs, then yes, you have these tremendous gains in well-being. But then at a point, you can see over here, it stops, it plateaus. So what the factors that affect well-being become issues like, also referenced earlier, level of corruption, income inequality, if you have a democratic government, other kinds of social policies. And of course, the gold standard, no pun intended, in this upper right-hand corner are the Scandinavian countries. The United States is maybe somewhere around here. Japan is around here. So this issue of, if constant pursuit of just material wealth alone is insufficient, let's take a look at a different slide. Here's another one. This is also a well-established finding. Relationship between income and well-being, reported well-being. So we know that since 1955 or so, holding dollars constant, average income in this country has more than doubled. But if you see that the people who say that they're very happy has basically stayed flat, or if you look really closely, it's actually gone down a little bit. Now, when I see slides like this, I don't know about you, but when I see slides like this, I think, what's wrong with those people, right? Like, obviously, they're not buying the right stuff, It's like if they had maybe a little bit, maybe they made their money a little too quickly and didn't, cultivate their taste well enough. And if they just got the right stuff, then it would be better, right? I mean, really, do we really believe that if you don't get more money, you aren't also happier? We have so many messages to that effect. But in my research for this, I found analogous, almost completely identical slides in representing the same phenomena, right? Increasing income, but level happiness. in both the United Kingdom and Japan. So we know it's a global phenomenon. You are almost certainly already aware of the growing movement in gross national happiness, which was a conference sponsored in the United Nations earlier this year, as a counterpoint or as a supplement to the notion of increasing gross domestic product. Now, one other thing I want to share with you on this slide that I was talking with a colleague yesterday. A fellow named Mark Williams, who's one of the world's leading researchers on stress, did very careful research to show that that the average level of stress that a person experiences today is analogous to, in the 1950s, what would have been considered pathological. Right? So the average level of stress that we experience today, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, would have been considered a disease state. All right? So this is one of the reasons I do my work. Right? How do we have tools to manage this kind of crazy experience we find ourselves in? So what does that mean that we're living with what were once considered, or we consider normal, what was once considered pathological levels of stress? It means that we're running around the world today and our brains are in survival mode. Right? We're just trying to get by. And what it means in terms of adaptation, or for those of you who've suffered through my class, and I see some of the victims in the audience, that when you're in a state of stress, your ability to adapt effectively, your ability to see the wider picture, right, diminishes. It's kind of too glib to say that stress makes you stupid, but it's kind of close, right? Your higher cortical functions go offline. So given that, right? So given that we're pursuing material comfort with no or little return, and in the context of ever-increasing levels of stress. In fact, your slide made me wonder if, in fact, you had this comment where the shareholder value is increasing, but stakeholder value, it's getting displaced to the stakeholders, and I wonder if this isn't, in fact, an expression of that, right? My income's going up, but I'm also bearing the stakeholder cost of living in this kind of environment. So, but anyway, a thought to ponder. So income is going up, happiness is kind of level, right? We're using up resources and we're getting stressed in the process. One has to ask the question, is this sustainable, right? So when Chris and I talked about how do we create or recreate or re-envision the role of business as a real win-win, I mean, we really mean it, right? How do you create a society or create a business culture that actually helps people, in addition to making them more comfortable? So, interestingly enough, as I think Vijay mentioned earlier, one of the things two things. Reading Peter Drucker is kind of like reading the Bible. You can always find something to justify your point of view. But I have to say, I've had the great fortune of having truly wonderful dialogues with my friend Joe Maciarello, and I think that I'm on solid ground when I say this. That in a book which is one of my favorites, a book called Landmarks for Tomorrow, which was, I think, written in 1957, published in 1959. 1959, right? Drucker is talking about this exact phenomena. That society needs to return to spiritual values, not to offset the material. Again, we're not anti-materialistic, wanting to kind of live a monk-like existence, right? Not to offset the material, but to make it fully productive. Right? How do we use this great benefit that we've created for ourselves to its maximum or optimal capacity? So this idea of returning to spiritual values is I suppose, the cornerstone of the work I do, even though I've never really talked about spirituality in my class, and whenever I talk about this work to somebody I know, they always start talking about spiritual stuff, and I thought, okay, that's the link people make in their mind, so maybe I should just embrace that. The question then, I think, is can we transform our material world as well as our inner world? Right? Can we start to rebalance this ability that we have to transform matter and make really great iPhones with the ability to transform our own internal state? Now, interesting time to be alive is that science is now asking the exact same question. So this is a photo of a Tibetan Buddhist monk who is undergoing a series of brain studies because talk about a bad hair day, right? There is exploding interest in the neurosciences of studying Asian contemplative practices to see what happens to the brain, right? How do we cultivate? You know, there were cultures that instead of developing their material world, developed their interior world. And so how can we bring these two things together? How can we understand what's going on with these processes? You know, how do we cultivate spiritual qualities? Let's take a look at some relatively recent findings. The top two findings are from this year alone. One is from March and the other is from April. I have to say, this is what is called contemplative neuroscience, right? The scientific study of meditative practices and what it does to the mind and brain is the hottest area in the neurosciences, right? And it's not a fringe thing, right? This is happening at Stanford, it's happening at Harvard Medical School, it's happening at Princeton, it's happening at MIT, it's happening at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is one of the great neuroscience labs of the world, and it's happening globally. In Europe, I have had the great pleasure of being in Sweden and Finland earlier this year, and as you remember, Sweden and Finland are in that upper high well-being, high material wealth corner, and they're starting to ask the questions, saying we've topped out materially. You know, as a society, we know that we're really kind of at the pinnacle, that we've managed to balance well-being and wealth in a very good way. But then, as you noticed, that curve tops out; it plateaus, and so now they're asking the question, what's next? Right? What's next after this? And so the discussions I've really had the great fortune of being a part of is to say, well, maybe what's next is that we cultivate our internal selves in addition to our material selves. So this is a very interesting and growing global movement that we're looking at. So what are some of these findings? What do they mean? So the top one is headed up by Eileen Luders, who's at UCLA. Unique brain anatomy of meditation practitioners alterations in cortical gyrification. Okay, anybody know what that means? Right? So what that means is that meditators' brains are more complicated, are more sophisticated. That if you do these practices, I should say also that it used to be that we thought that your brain kind of slowed down its development around age 18, and after that you kind of had this gentle glide into senility, right? So, but that's actually not what happens. What we find is that there's now a well-established phenomena of something called neuroplasticity, which means that your brain can change throughout your lifespan and that your brain changes in response to your experience. I like to say that you get the brain you practice, right? So as a neuroscientist friend of mine explained it to me, you know, everybody's face has the same part, but everybody's face is unique, and our brains are analogous to that. So our brains are kind of unique imprints of our own experiencing. We can change our brains, we can self-direct this transformation, and that's what meditative practices are. They aren't about levitating the cat or having an out-of-body experience. They're about systematic methods of training your brain's function, shifting your brain's function and structure. The Luders study shows that as the more one meditates, the deeper and more profound the shift becomes. The result is that you have enhanced cognitive processing, you're better able to make decisions, you have improved memory. It's basically an upgrade of your own processes. The second study comes from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which I referred to earlier, and the regulation of neural circuitry of emotion by compassion meditation, effects of meditative experience. One of the things that when Drucker was talking about in Landmarks for Tomorrow, the need to cultivate spiritual values, one of the things that he named specifically was compassion. That we couldn't have materialism without compassion. We had to have materialism, we had to have compassion along with materialism in order to keep society sane and humane. We tend to think of compassion as a character trait, right? Or maybe something that saints have. Well, what this study is showing, and there are more studies like this, is that compassion can be cultivated. That we can develop this capacity. And in the third study, which comes from Stanford, Loving Kindness Meditation Increases Social Connectedness, what this finds is that you can do practices, which my students do, that help to increase your ability to connect with other human beings. right? Not to fall into your own self-centered, self-defensive routine. Let's take a look at some work from Yale by a man named Judson Brewer. This is kind of an appetizer worth of data. What's going on here? You see these blue lines and red lines. This is a study of 4 trials where a man is being put into a real-time functional magnetic resonance imaging device. There are only a few of these machines on the continent. What that means is that they're able to scan the brain real time, right? They're able to process the brain, what's happening in the brain real time, and so they can have a dialogue with the person inside the scanner. And this man is a novice meditator. And he's doing the practice in the machine, right? And they did 4 runs, so that's what's going on. The red lines represent his egocentric processing, right? His own self-centered processing. And the blue line represents non-egocentric processing, right? So he's just, it's stepping out of his own ego boundary, his own self-centeredness. And you can see as the study and the day goes on, he becomes completely blue, right? Figuratively speaking. And so what this is showing is that we're able to cultivate this capacity to step beyond ourselves. And what happens, what comes out of this is, if we pull the camera back, and these are all studies that have happened, right? You get this shift. What does this get you doing these kind of things? Right? You get reduced egocentrism, right? You get reduced cognitive bias, right? In other words, you become more objective, right? You reduce your emotional reactivity, and obviously you reduce your stress, right? Good thing, because we got a lot of it. And what gets better, right? And when we talk about a positive motion, right? When Chris referenced, how can we flourish? Right? So this is not just about reducing things, but how do we enhance capacities? We become more rational. There are now economic studies that show that people who do these practices become more rational. They make more rational economic decisions. Very interesting, right? In addition to becoming more rational, you become more creative. Obviously, you enhance your well-being. And then here are the spiritual qualities, right? You become more altruistic and compassionate. And the final one is that what we call perceptual clarity, right? That you're able to see the world clearly. This is also a big Drucker theme, which I'll talk about in a minute. So these are all verified scientific findings, and just in time, right? Because we know, and as Vijay referenced and Chris referenced, right, there are a lot of changes ahead, big changes, right? And that we're going to have to adapt to them. And so by being able to enhance human capacity, right, I think we can start to meet these challenges in a more positive and productive way without falling back into our own fears and anxieties and angers, so that we can solve these problems more effectively, right? And so this is Gregory Bateson, who was a contemporary of Drucker's, who was one of the leading figures in developing systems theory. I think this is a fascinating statement that the major problems of the world are the result of the difference between how nature works and the way people think. And so there's this mismatch between the complexity of the world and our capacity to grasp it. Right? Nature is one thing, but our models of nature are another, and they're insufficient. I think that in reflecting about, so this is the pivot to sustainability. Right? I think that one core problem is that we can live with the illusion we don't need nature. I know this is true for me, right? That our technology is so sophisticated and so all-encompassing and so powerful that I can flip a switch and a light comes on. I can turn a knob and water comes out, right? I can push a button and my home gets warmed, right? What does nature have to do with any of that? Right? We don't have the direct perception that we need nature. Right? So it's this abstraction somewhere. Nature is a place we go to. Right? The beach or national parks or something like that, we don't realize that nature is all around us, right? And that, and we kind of ignore it, especially here in Los Angeles, right? Because we've channelized rivers, we've imported all kinds of trees and plants that don't belong here. And so we've really become dominions over matter. We have this dominion over matter that allows us this luxury of believing we don't really need nature. And so the businesses that start with the assumption of natural interdependence have a competitive advantage, right? Because they're dealing with reality in a more clearer way. This book, Strangers to Ourselves by Timothy Wilson. Timothy Wilson is a psychologist at the University of Virginia. It's a fantastic read if you're looking for some good holiday reading. This is week 4 of my class. The adaptive unconscious. You should know that our brain works primarily on autopilot, 90+%, right? And one reason for that is that we have a limited capacity of attention, okay? The nervous system can assimilate 11 million bits of information per minute, okay? Or per second, sorry. That seems like a lot. Now, for those of you who haven't taken my class, do you want to take a guess as to how much of that 11 million bits of information per second you're consciously aware of? Less than 1%. We have an optimist. Anybody else? 1,000. I feel like Bob Barker on The Price is Right. 100. We're getting really optimistic. The answer is 40. So, which is 0.00001%, something like that. So we have all this information that our bodies, are absorbing, but we have this tiny amount that we're actually consciously aware of. And that creates some problems, which Drucker was actually well aware of and wrote a great deal about. Not using this language, but if you read it, it's there. We operate largely on habit, right? We're on autopilot most of the time. Our schema of how we see the world, right? Our emotional patterns, our thought patterns, behavioral patterns are all roughly automated. And anybody who's gotten in their car in the morning and half hour later or whatever shown up at the office and was completely blank in that intervening period knows this quite well, right? How did I get here? Where was I, right? Because the whole pathway to between work and home is so routinized that we don't really need to be conscious for it, right? It's the non-conscious pattern playing out. I can remember in 2003, I used to live in this great $550 a month apartment in Pomona, and then I moved to Montrose, which is east of Pasadena. And one night after teaching, I got in my car and I drove home, and I see that there's somebody in my parking space, and I'm swearing because I was tired and late, and then I realized I don't live here anymore, right? So, and that was just that's the automatic nature of our brain. So we learn faster than we unlearn, right? And I hadn't unlearned the old route and learned the new route. A few years ago at Drucker Day, they played this wonderful interview with Peter, and he said, I think the question was posed to him, what's the most important thing for an executive to learn? And he says, the most important thing for an executive to learn is how to unlearn. And so with the changes that are coming, I think that we have to unlearn a lot, and we have to learn a lot. So in a changing world, right, our maps become outdated very easily. Right? This is a 1640 Spanish map depicting the island of California. And so for many of us, we have the maps depicting the island of California dictating our actions. And if we're to embrace, the transformation of an economy, we have to unlearn how to do that. So because much of our activity is non-conscious, we have to cultivate, and this is what all my classes are about, and Drucker understood this as well. In The New Realities in 1989, he talks about training perception, the importance of training perception, that our education institutions had done a very good job in training rationality. We've trained people to think extremely well, but we haven't necessarily trained them to see. And so in a changing world, we need to be able to see the changes clearly, right? To make sure we're not using the old map. And only by being able to see the world clearly can we adapt effectively. Okay, does that make sense? I know it's kind of abstract. So I'd like to assert that flourishing rests on cultivating high-quality attention, right? That we need to be able to see, right? So we cultivate attention to create more choices. This is what all my classes are about. We create choices by learning how to perceive the world more clearly so we can step out of old ways of doing, acting, thinking, and behaving, right? And this is how we flourish. This is how we have to leave, right? We have to leave the old world. And leaving the old world is terrifying for many of us, right? And think about the competitor to the tenant, right, who says, hey, he can't do that, right? We're a chemicals business, and he's now in this water business, right? That's terrifying if you're the CEO of that company. But then how do you work through the terror to step into a new world so that you can actually be an effective competitor to tenant, right? That's, I think, the issue many of our leaders are facing. How do you manage what is really an existential crisis that happens when your business model comes under attack because of shifting global conditions? And one way I think we've seen it is to just deny that it's happening, right? Which is not that effective in the long run, right, in terms of adaptation. How do we use contemplative practices to energize our flourishing, right? How do we cultivate these positive generative capacities to be able to meet what will seem like life-threatening circumstances to us? And then how can we adapt to those problems in a way that actually can potentially create something better? That's the assertion Chris and I are making. That in a truly sustainable world, you have businesses that are successful and prosperous, right, and produce material wealth, but at the same time, how do we also cultivate these capacities to improve our own quality of experience so that we can adapt effectively? So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
So I'm going to say we have time for a half a question since we're a little bit over schedule. But we will field one or two questions, and we do have one in the back here, so we will take those.
The woman that you referred to about positive handprint, it would be good if we have credit for her.
Catherine Bottrell. An easy one.
Terrific stuff, guys. I could get up and riff for about half an hour just on that graph of income versus happiness. And it set off a raging debate in my brain about what's going on there. And so what's going on, how can that be, and what does it mean? And I just have one little suggestion. And as the income goes up, subtract out increasing productivity, because I think that's an important part of the picture. And the other thing is, you showed the fMRI stuff.
Yeah.
Harvard is looking again at things like LSD and psilocybin, and I think that kind of research is not going to be complete without some of that woven in, so look for some exciting stuff coming out of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
This was just an amazing presentation, so I want to start by thanking the two of you for it. It was mind-opening and very exciting. There was a slide, Jeremy, that you showed that it was an n=1 situation, but it was really baffling, which was the gentleman in the MRI going through repeated runs of apparently meditation or something like that. And in run 3, he was more egocentric.
Yeah.
Is that an isolated incident?
No.
And what are the implications organizationally and societally of run 3?
Yes, that's a great, I just lost the slideshow. Wonderful question. What happened there was that he started ruminating in his own thinking. And then so it went red. He was actually testing the machine. So let's see if we can get that. We probably can't get there fast enough, but yeah, that's what was happening. Part of what I want to do is to try to put back into the equation the fact that we're actually highly emotional. And we need to learn how to manage the emotion rather than just pretending it's not there. So that's a quick answer, but yeah. Thank you.
I know we have, I recognize you have the potential for many, many more questions, but I'm actually going to, with your permission, kind of